I want to write an article about the history of social cognitive theory for my readers. And I have received a copy of your book, Moral Disengagement. And I would like to dedicate some time to that as well, because I think it's a very important.
Oh, by all means,
so
let's be happy to do that.
Great. So those are the two main subjects. But before we start, I am really curious. I have read your autobiography, which you wrote in 2006, and you referred to K through 12 education. So I was wondering, could you reflect on your time in K through 12 education? How do you look back on that time?
Sure. So you can ask me that question, and I'll be happy to explain it.
Great. So, how do you look back on your high school and primary school period?
Well, you see, my parents migrated from Europe. They had no schooling, very little resources, and it took them a little while to be able to buy a homestead.
Yeah.
And these were the these were the pioneers of the Canadian nation. So they had to build their own schools, their own churches, their homes, and so on. So they weren't adjusting to a society; they were creating it.
Yeah.
And the school had very limited resources. Grades 1 through high school were all taught in one schoolroom, one schoolhouse, and so in that high school area, there were 3 teachers trying to teach the entire curriculum, and then I had to take courses by correspondence, and and the teachers weren't necessarily all that informed on the subject matter. So a group of us got together and decided we're going to educate.
Yeah.
And so with the help of what the teachers could give us, we essentially developed self-defense, self-directed learning.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, these deficient facilities would be regarded as a huge handicap. This turned out to be one of the most important developments, because it taught me how to educate myself.
Yeah.
And so those were the facilities, very, very primitive, and but there are about 3 of us in which we managed pretty well, and that was a. And then I had to take courses by correspondence. For example, on Friday I would turn on the radio and then sing Sturle Pone Davinon Tuli Monde Tuli Monde.
I know that song.
Taking French, from someone out there in Quebec.
Yeah.
And so that was my high school background.
So what kind of pedagogies were used? I mean, I know that there was a time when John Dewey was getting really popular. I mean, of course, the theory of John Dewey. So what kind of approach did they have on your primary school?
It was mostly survival. I don't think they heard about any of this. No, I cannot discern any particular philosophy guiding the teaching. The teaching was how to survive.
The teaching was how to survive. So you had to teach yourself practically, but it worked out for you very well. But you have to agree with me that for a lot of people that doesn't work at all. So you're quite.
Oh no! For a number of people, that's tragic.
So you were lucky. So how come you were one of the very few ones to manage to escape that environment and to go to university? What was your secret?
Yeah, I see. Virtually, most of the graduates went on to farming.
Yeah.
There were very few who went on to college. My parents didn't have any formal education, but they had a very strong commitment to promoting educational development. So one day my mother sat me down and said, Albert, you have to decide what you want to do with your life. You can stay here and till the soil, play pool, and drink yourself to oblivion in the beer parlor, or you might try to get an education. Yeah. Given the neutral choices, education seemed like the better alternative. Now, although the instruction is pretty limited, I did very well in the courses, and so one day the principal called my parents in and said, Albert shouldn't be a farmer. You should send him to college. Yeah. And they said, well, that's all fine, but we don't have any money to do that. So in college, I took a very heavy course in the morning, and I worked in a sash and door place in the afternoon. So I got my BA in 3 years, and then I got my PhD in 3 years.
Wow.
So in 6 years, I went from this deficient school to a PhD.
That's amazing.
And so the question here is, how does a Alberta farm boy end up amidst the bombing palms at Stanford University?
Yeah.
And that my educational history pretty much informed my agentic theory that namely that people can affect their experiences and their life courses by their actions, and that unless people and also this led to the development of self-efficacy theory. Unless people believe that they can produce effects by their actions, they have no incentive to act or to persevere in the face of difficulties. So whatever other factors may serve as guides and motivators, they are rooted in the core belief that one can make a difference by one's actions. So conditions force me to really work hard to develop the background for a field in psychology.
So your parents were true pioneers. They migrated from Poland and Ukraine to Canada. Don't you think you inherited some gene that that gave you these agents from your parents? It was
you see, my parents didn't have any formal education, but they were smart as hell.
Yeah.
They, for example, they had to build their own roads. My father was the one who was the director of that. there was this small town where all the goods came in by train, and so we had a draining system in which we would pick up all the items coming into town, coal, lumber, and all the items for the stores, and then deliver it from the train to the centers there. And in addition, there was a big mill in town where people came in to have their grains developed. So and so we had a large barn in that town that my mother ran, in which people would park their horses there while they were waiting to have their grain tilled, and then we had a bunk for them where they could spend the night, and so we had both this farm and also this small business in town.
How?
So they were. My father was the first to buy a Model T Ford, and a couple of the farmers, neighboring farmers, asked to borrow it.
Yeah.
And so when they were driving back drunk as hell, they ran into a set of horses, and that was the end of the Model T Ford.
Really? Wow. Man, what? How did he react? I mean, he was devastated, of course.
Oh, of course. So they turned it into a wagon with tires.
How important were your Polish and Ukrainian roots? Were they always present, or were you really adapted to Canadian life very, very quickly?
Well, no, my father was Polish, my mother was Ukrainian.
Yes.
So that was a bit of argument there. And then there was a huge religious center there, and so you see, my mother was very religious, but my father was not, and so in the morning, Sunday morning, my mother said, "Come on, go to church." And my father said, "No, leave him alone. He's a young boy. He needs to grow."
Really?
and my father used to meet with the priest and drink the holy wine, which my mother was very upset about. One Christmas Eve, they had consumed too much of the wine, and the priest fell down and brought the whole Christmas tree down.
That's amazing.
So it was an interesting life. Now, the other thing is, my parents, when I was in high school, my parents felt I really should get out of this town and sort of increase my visions and so on. So I would go into Edmonton and get a job in a fashion door a place where so I became a pretty skilled carpenter, and then in my final year before completing high school, I came home and I said, "There's this fantastic job in the Yukon." Fortunately, they didn't know where the Yukon was and what I was getting into, and you in Whitehorse.
And you knew what Yukon was, the University of Connecticut. That was, I mean, you were from Mundare for Pete's sake.
Oh, that's right, and this was a military operation. You see, Alaska Highway was built on muskeg, so it keeps sinking. And so every 80 miles they had a base camp where they continued to pour gravel on it to maintain the erosion. And so I was at one of these base camps. So when, I drove in on a bus, and then there was an ambulance there, and someone was being loaded in the ambulance, and I introduced myself and asked someone whether somebody had been hurt, and said, hell no, that's our cook. He drank all the lemon extract for the booze, and we have to go and have his stomach pumped out again.
Wow.
So I knew this was not Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
Amazing.
And so I noticed that they were ordering vast amount of sugar. And I knew if you have a lot of sugar, there's some mash somewhere.
Yeah.
And they were brewing their own. And then as the mash got more alcoholic, they were getting up earlier to test. And then one day they got up at some ungodly early morning, and this is going to be D-Day. And then they came back in about 20 minutes, probably the greatest collective depression in the Yukon. The grizzly bears got into their Yukon, into their mash,
Wow.
and we had 4 drunk grizzly bears in the camp. As they were stuck in, the dogs were sort of barked at them to try to hit them and fall down. And they didn't exactly know how to get up. So you see, the money I made in Edmonton and in the Yukon carried me through the first year of school. And I chose University of British Columbia because I was in search of a more benign climate.
Yeah. So let's take a giant leap, because I would like to dedicate some time to the history of social cognitive theory. And
sure.
In your autobiography, it starts right about social learning and imitation by Miller and Dollard. Let's go from there.
Okay. It's kind of interesting. At the time, it was pretty much dominated by behaviorism, and I was puzzled. I was never convinced that this could be the sole form of learning, because I could see all these complex social systems, the complex behaviors that were changing rapidly and so on. I couldn't understand how this could be created by trial and error learning. And so I figured there are 2 basic modes of learning. One is by direct experience, and the other is by modeling. And we had a theory that was entirely based on direct experience, and then they rejected modeling because they couldn't understand how a person could sit there and observe patterns of behavior and not perform any responses and get reinforced.
Yeah.
And so Miller and Dollard really converted modeling to just a special case of instrumental learning. But there was no interest even in Miller and Dollard. They didn't do any research. What they did was research to show that modeling doesn't exist. And so when I came to Stanford, I decided that I'm going to really explore social modeling as a serious alternative to trial and error learning. And so my first study was a large-scale study on the transmission of aggression and the power of social modeling.
Aggression in families,
so
right?
What's that?
Aggression in families, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It was really an ambitious study in which I wasn't interested in how kids in bad environments turn out badly.
No.
What I was interested is why do kids from advantaged backgrounds become major delinquents. So what I did, I went to Belmont, which is one of the really ritzy areas in Oakland, and then I got information as which kids are reporting to the delinquency department. And so what I did is match families in the same area, intact families in the same area. In one case, the kid was a serious delinquent, and in the other case, the kid was developing well. And so we had an elaborate interview with the father, the mother, and the kid in each case, in both sets of families.
Yes.
And what we discovered is the fathers were modeling a hell of a lot of aggression, teaching the kid how to fight, and if the kid had trouble in school, they would come in and fight with the teacher. And so what they were doing is modeling aggression, not physically, but demanding that his kid really stand up. And he felt that I would say, how do you want your kid to be different from you? And he said, well, I wasn't aggressive enough. He was equating assertiveness with aggression. Well, I wasn't aggressive enough. That's why I didn't really make it up the ladder. And so then, after that study, I figured you should be able to do studies experimentally, and that's when I began to do research on modeling, identifying 4 processes through which it works, namely attentional processes, namely you gotta pay attention, representational processes, namely the modeling is fleeting, but you have to have some symbol of it, and then reproduction, how do you translate thought to action, and finally motivational, we don't go around exhibiting everything we learn observationally, and so motivation determines which modeled practices we will adopt and which we will ignore. So in this context, I was doing these studies, and there was a really fundamental environmental change in which we had the advent of television.
Yeah.
And so I was one of my colleagues in communications said, Al, I was doing a series of studies, said, why don't you study one condition in which the model is symbolic? And I said, sure. I didn't realize at that time that this, you see, virtually all of our theories are based on information from direct experience.
Yes.
The advent of television and the other, that was the beginning of a transformative change of the environment from the local, social, and so on to symbolic modeling.
Yes, yes.
And I suddenly realized this was the beginning of this fantastic transitional change, and so I decided now to begin to study with modeling within a symbolic mode. And little did I know that this was really the direction in which reality was going, and psychology didn't recognize the importance of the symbolic environment. For example, if the and so I was doing a whole bunch of studies on a variety of areas, and if Darwin were today, he would be going to Silicon Valley rather than the Galapagos. Because that's where all the environmental realities are, and so I was now, in my theory, I was talking about the coevolution, and that the symbolic environment is gaining primacy in the coevolution process. So it was really a fundamental transition, and
there is the Bobodol experiment. Was it before you started your family research on violence,
No.
or after?
No. When I was asked to testify before the Senate, you see what happened is suddenly you had this infusion of television, and the television industry was working on the assumption that people are attracted to violence. So they were just throwing a whole bunch of violence in the programs. For example, I was testifying before the Senate, and there was was producing the program. I think it was a program in which he had the feeling that you could produce a program that's both attractive and educational. And so the program was centered on oceanography and all the suspense there and so on. So he gets a memo from New York, said, your program is very attractive and so on, but for Christ's sakes, get it out from under the water and put it on the beach and inject some youthful sex and violence.
I see. Yeah.
And so when I was doing this laboratory research, they said, "Why don't you throw in?" And that was the Bobodol experiment, and I did other experiments, not just and you see, that was the beginning of my interest in moving toward the symbolic environment as one that psychology should be addressing. Yeah. For example, if you ask, see, we have a lot of research on the importance of peer interaction in adolescence. That was all based on, your peers in your immediate school or neighborhood or what have you. Well, now that information is really not generalizable very much to currently, because now the kids have any number of kind of relationships. They're texting them honest constantly. They're building and changing them. So this is so the new research on the importance of peer modeling and peer interaction.
Yeah,
you gotta go electronically now.
Yeah.
To understand this. So anyway, now the British Psychological Association asked me to write a paper on the legacy of the Bobadil experiment.
Yes.
And I pointed out that this thing had not only was significant in the shift of the environment, but one day I got a call from Miguel Salido in Mexico City. He said, I read your Bobadil study and I extracted a whole bunch of principles from it, and I'm building long-running serial dramas to try to address some of the most urgent problems. Yeah. And he said, can I come down and show you my videos? And I thought, they're going to be this one shot, where you're going to show it. What he was showing me is videos that are running 1 or 2 years, in which they were promoting literacy and trying to reduce fertility rates and so on. I was struck by the creativity.
Yes.
So then, and this was the beginning, and so Sabito had the dramatic talent, I had the theoretical, but I was arguing in order to promote large-scale change, you need 3 models.
Yeah.
You need a good theoretical model, you need a good translational model, but you also need a good diffusion model.
Yes.
And so there was a program in New York where they were focusing on trying to reduce population growth. And when they heard Sabito's first program was on promoting literacy, because the people in Mexico, most of them weren't going to go to school. And so he developed a serial drama in which, but they tried it, but they had very little response. And that's most of our public policies are deficient because they don't consider the human factor in them. So Sabito, I said, test why people weren't participating in it. And it turned out there were 3 barriers. One, they felt that you can learn reading only while you're young, and you can't learn it as an adult. The second was a very low sense of efficacy. I don't have the ability for this complex skill. And the third was a sense of self-unworthiness. Why would anyone who knows how to read want to waste any time with me? And so Sabito got a popular performer as the one who knows how to read, and then she hits up these people and they all explain these attitudes, and those are clarified. And then the program shows him going and getting the primers, and and they're learning how to read, and they get some discouragement, but now they're gaining skill. They're reading the Constitution. There a lot of humor, a lot of arguments, and so on. And so, but the findings were, before the serial drama, they were I think about 9,000 who subscribed, and during the serial drama they had a whole million who subscribed.
Amazing. Yeah. So that was your theory in practice.
What's that?
That was your theory in practice. The best example you could get.
No, he called me and he said, I read this Bovedal experiment. So he based the serial drama on the principles reflected in the Bovedal experiment.
Yeah.
And so now we were collaborators. And then the second was on trying to curtail population growth. And so he used two different models. These are two sisters. One works in the family planning clinic. She's got a couple of kids, and they're leading a very nice life. The other one has 11 kids living in tremendous poverty, and then there's this confrontation between her daughter, who now has one child. She's pregnant with the third, and she confronts him and says, I got to stop this. Look at this. Look at them. And what she's doing is essentially you're condemning your kids to poverty.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do that. And her mother, when she first mentioned this, and I said, "Oh, God is giving us another one," and she said, "Stop! I don't want any more." And then you model, how can a wife get a reluctant husband to a family planning clinic?
Yeah.
And this is why you got to model for people how to overcome resistances. And so eventually they get him there, and then they begin to adopt family planning practices and so on. And so and the program increased attendance at family planning clinics by 32%.
Wow.
The number of contraceptions that were sold in the past 2 years, it was increased by about 5 or 7%, and after the program, that shot up to 35%.
That's amazing. Well, you got the same results in India, right? In India and Africa, the same impact.
Oh yeah, and so now we extended this to Africa, Asia, Latin America. We're working pretty hard in Africa because they're scheduled to double their population in 25 years.
Wow.
They can't support the population currently, and with a doubling, we're going to have a lot of environmental people who are going to be trying to these are the ones who are going to be the new folks, and so it's been going for about 15 years. It continues, and it's based on good theory, really creative implementation, and for diffusion. We don't go into the country unless we're invited, and if they're invited, we get funding from the UN and other sources, and then we go into the host country and work with their media personnel to create a serial drama that's appropriate to their culture. And so that's really a remarkable application of our theory.
It is.
To addressing really fundamental problems.
I was wondering, Dr. Bandura, were you ever involved in Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment?
No.
Because that's a great, I mean, that's a great bridge, by the way, to moral disengagement. It's a book I want to talk about as well.
Oh yeah. No, Walter, Michelle, and I said we're gonna bake a cake and put a hacksaw in there and see whether or not they can escape.
Yeah. But
neither of us could cook. So.
Oh, all right. But you got tenure for 50 years, so you witnessed the experiment, right? Philip Zimbardo's experiment.
What?
Philip
What's
Zimbardo.
that?
Well, I'm sure you were aware of Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment at the time. I mean, you worked in the same.
Oh yeah.
Same building, right?
Oh yeah, it was in the basement of our building.
Yeah. So it was considered unethical, especially nowadays. So how did?
Nowadays, yeah, and even the Bovedal experiment probably would be denied.
Why would
by the human subjects?
I see.
Well, they might say you're training kids to be aggressive.
I see. Yeah. I just before we go to the moral disengagement, we've got about 20 minutes. I was wondering when I think of self-efficacy, I always make the cross connection with growth mindset, Carol Dweck's growth mindset. So you know her work, of course. She's also a Stanford professor, Carol Dweck. Your daughter did.
Oh no, no, it has nothing to do with that research. You see, I was creating. See, this is another interesting transformative period.
Yes.
At that time, psychoanalytic theory was dominating clinical psychology and the national culture, and it was clear by the late 50s that this theory lacked predictiveness, it lacked validity, and so this is the time when we transformed the field of psychotherapy from the psychodynamic model to the social cognitive model. Mm-hmm. And the way that, and so it was in that context I was working on a guided mastery treatment in which you would help people to confront the problems, and you would use mastery aids for them to be able to overcome it, and so on. And so people were saying, yeah, but I was working with snake phobics, thinking that it's sort of a circumscribed problem like hell. I mean, the whole life was changed. They couldn't go with their families, to parks or so on. They couldn't do gardening. They were tortured with terroristic dreams and so on. So it really totally impaired their lives. And so, critics say, but this is because in a couple of hours I cure them all.
It's amazing. Yeah.
And so they said, but does it last? So we brought them back, and they were just as bold as at the end of treatment. But then they explained to us they're really grateful for being rid of their phobia, but the treatment had a more effect on their lives. They said, we figured that we could overcome this damn thing that killed their lives for 20, 30 years, and we could overcome it in such a short period. Think of what I could do in the other areas that I avoided. And so they threw themselves into these other activities and found out that, they can do these things and so on. What they were telling me is that we had increased their sense of self-efficacy, and they were acting on that belief and proceeding much to their supplies.
So are you saying that self-efficacy is some kind of generic capacity? It applies to other domains as well.
Oh yes, the thing about if you look at the self-efficacy book, the chapters are education, health, critical problems, athletics, organizational behavior, and then collective efficacy. And the amazing thing about self-efficacy is its generality across different domains, and that's true of the moral disengagement book. There are 8 mechanisms, and I demonstrate that those mechanisms explain it regardless of whether it's entertainment, whether it's guns, whether it's tobacco, whether
terrorism,
it's finance, whether it's capital punishment, whether it's terrorism and counterterrorism, and then most important, whether it affects the sustainability of our environment. And so what you have is the remarkable predictiveness across not only about areas in psychology, but across disciplines and so on. So it's remarkable generalizability.
It is. Do you know Carol Dweck's fixed mindset and growth mindset? Do you know her theory of Professor Carol Dweck?
Oh yes, of course. So she, in fact, one of the essentially. What she gets away from the notion that you have these fixed beliefs or so on, and that you should evaluate behavior by the progress you make and so on. So, in fact, one of my experiments. Was a test. I worked with the experiment was with students these are students in the business program.
Okay.
And so they came in and we said we have a computer simulation of a company, and you're going to be playing the role of the leader of this outfit, and then you will be you have to make decisions about, and then we gave them about 5 or 6 criteria by which they would make decisions, and that they were told that they will be given tasks in which they would have to decide how many people to put into that and which ones and so on. So it was Bob Wood who came from Australia, and he had studied how these factors operate in actual activities. So he had a fantastic model that was closely linked to the way it works in real life. And so they'll be given tasks and they'll get feedback. In one condition, they were told that that this measures your inherent ability. And the second group was told that this is a skill to work at. The longer you work at it, the more skilled you become. So this is the dichotomy that Dweck uses. Is it a inherent trait, or is it changeable? So,
but do you see
we find that we found that those who were led to believe that it's an innate capacity, as they got negative feedback, their efficacy started dropping. They refused. They no longer adopted challenging goals. Whereas those who were led to believe that it's a factor that you can control, they're the ones who, over time, their efficacy increased, their goal setting was more ambitious, and their problem solving was more effective. And then I did another study with as an honors project to one of my students, in which they were called in and said, we're studying this complex neurophysiological system and how it works, and so one group was told that this was measuring their inherent capability, and the other group was told that this is a manipulable skill, and so they were working on this particular task, and they got feedback, and so those who thought that this was measuring their basic neurophysiological capability, their performance started to decline. In the case where they're told this acquirable skill, you aren't so good when you begin, but then you can get better. They're the ones where their efficacy increased, performance increased, and then at the end, they were told you can work with this thing some more because there's some free time, or you could leave. And so those who thought that this was measuring their inherent ability couldn't wait to get out of the room. They would like to hang around a bit more. So those are two studies which are very directly related to Carol's theory.
But of Robert Rosenthal's Pygmalion effect, it shows similarities, right? Yeah. Well, I'd like to end this interview by asking you a couple of questions about your book, Moral Disengagement, because I think this is so important for this time period. In your interview with, with Gian Vittorio, you said, in one of your interviews, you said, so this is where I have to find some small islands that cannot be found, because you are addressing some serious issues. And you...
Well, you see, in the moral disengagement, I described when I was testifying before Congress that exposure to televised violence increases violence in children.
Yes.
The network tried to undermine my scholarship. And so they mounted a campaign in which they hired some they had this guy at University of Denver. They would just bring him in whenever they wanted, and so I had a article in Book Magazine about this. They were putting out an edition on youth, and so he wrote this this criticism that how do we know Bandura didn't stack the experimental group with aggressive kids?
Mm-hmm.
And then he said he included only one control group, but for every experimental group he had to have a control group.
Yeah.
So it was horrible. But anyway, it was widely used, and they went after me. They figured we're gonna kill this guy.
Was this after you? Was it after you published the book or before?
Oh no! This is when I published the Robidol experiment.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and so they hired some psychologists that were sort of. NBC would always call on those psychologists for criticizing media research, and then the guide, the TV guide, they had 6 or 7 editorials, most of them attacking me. Saying things like the Surgeon General is acting as though Rome is building and burning, and Bandura is a fire extinguisher, and this kind of stuff. And so this was appearing in the public press. So our chair called me down and said, Al, there's a lot of stuff being published questioning the quality of your research. As he's saying this, I'm thinking now of my vita, how I should expand it for the next job. And he said, Al, I have only one thing to say, and my heart started beating even faster. And he said, don't let the bastards wear you down. So if you read the chapter on the entertainment, I have a whole section there of how they tried to kill me.
Yeah.
I figured, when I wrote the moral disengagement book, good God, I'm in order to prevent them from saying that these are distorted interpretations, I quote them personally. So this is what they said, not what I interpreted, and I assumed that they might go after me. Tobacco.
You made some powerful enemies, Dr. Bandura. So, have you got any?
Oh yeah, these are and the gun industry.
Oh wow!
Good God! I think I haven't heard from them. I think they don't know about the book and haven't read it.
Well,
but I figured, I don't have to worry about tenure.
No.
And,
have you got any?
So what the hell?
Have you got any gotten any feedback already from those powerful industries after you released?
No, none at all. None at all.
Wow.
That's because I don't think they know it exists. But if they find out.
Well, it was 3 years ago. They should have known it by now, right? It's not going to happen.
Well, if that, then I'm really puzzled about the silence.
Yeah. I wonder, Dr. Bandura, why didn't you devote a chapter to politics, especially in the Trump era?
Huh?
I mean...
Oh, I have the chapter on terrorism and counterterrorism.
All right.
That whole section is an indictment on the U.S. We went in there on false pretenses. You ask the authorities why they were going to Iraq for oil. That whole effort was, so I have a whole section on how the government got perverted and the way in which, for example, you have a general who says, well, you know, the moral principles are you should try to keep the civilian casualties to the limited. That's the just war as to how you enact it. And so the general says, well, we decided it's pretty hard to measure civilians, so we aren't going to do it anymore, and so on. So anyway, that whole section is an indictment of our war in Iraq and how we really created this mess in the Middle East.
What my penultimate question is: what projects are you working on currently?
Currently, I'm very much concerned about trying to preserve the survival of this planet. And it's not encouraging. And so I have a paper in the American Psychologist in which I explain that the UN had 20 annual summits to try to get international agreement on reducing the heat-trapping gases, and they did nothing.
No.
Then they met in Paris, and they wouldn't agree, so they would make sort of promises that were unmeasurable and unenforceable.
Yeah.
And then when they met in Poland the next year, they weren't even meeting their pledges. So it's clear that, and then I just, why aren't responsible people agreeing to reduce the emissions? Because we have about 20 years left, and if the heat is going to continue to soar, that's going to thaw the permafrost, which has been protecting huge amounts of CO2 and methane and so on, and we're going to set a process of feedback, positive feedback, in which the hotter, the more they release, the hotter, and there isn't a hell of a thing that people are going to be able to do about it.
But what's your plan?
And
what's your plan? What are you?
My conclusion is there's no way the adults are going to do it. First of all, in the chapter, I have all the moral disengagement that enables to do it without any guilt. Then I point out we have this huge population growth, and then we have polluting lifestyle that people don't want to give up. And so I concluded that adults can't do it. But then I have a section that what we need to do is create or enlist a global youth movement, environmental movement, in which they will do it. They will force the adults to do it.
Yes.
And I have examples of 9-year-olds and 11-year-olds and so on, actually convincing cities to outlaw plastic bags and there they set up huge programs on reforestation, which sucks up the CO2. And anyway, I have 8 of those examples. And then, this 16-year-old from Sweden
Greta.
somehow got invited to Dover.
Yes.
She got up there and said, "I'm not here to beg you to do anything. You haven't done it and you won't do it. I'm here to tell you that we're going to do it whether you like it or not."
That's amazing. That's amazing.
And so it was a fun article to write, an important one of how, and her comments sparked a worldwide boycott in schools with hundreds of thousands of students. That's the group that's going to produce difference, not adults. They're a complete failure. But shall we get to moral disengagement?
Yeah. We are there already in moral disengagement.
Okay. Well, a comprehensive psychological theory must address, the morality in people's lives.
Yeah.
By the way, the APA is almost just as responsible. How many articles do you see in the APA on climate and environmental sustainability?
None. Not one.
None. None. This is totally irresponsible. The problem is, you see, they want quickie studies, and they don't want to study climate change when you're going to have to wait 5 years to see whether or not change. But anyway, so we can't have theories floating around in which we ignore the moral influences. So I thought addressing the issue of morality was really central to further development of my theory.
How can I apply the theory of moral disengagement in my educational practice?
Oh yeah, well, first of all, the theory addresses education at 3 levels. The first is at the student level, and that's where we help children to develop interest in schools by promoting their efficacy and so on. But that's primarily at the student level. Where the politics come in especially is, there's a politics that children are from disadvantaged schools are really not being adequately provided with education, so there's a whole business of moral disengagement as to how minority students are handled and so on. The second is at the teacher level. And, at the child level, here we're, as I say, primarily heavy emphasis on the process of building efficacy, but the way in which children are treated and the way at the teacher level, they're underpaid, so there are fewer really talented people not going into the field of education. They are derogated. They aren't given adequate facilities, so in some cases they have to use their own money. And so at the teacher level, there are two aspects. One is how to promote teacher advocacy, and then so I have a model on that. But the second part is political. We treat our teachers awful compared to how teachers are treated in other cultures and so on, and there's a lot of moral disengagement in the way in which we're mistreating children because of the way in which we aren't supporting and the educational systems. We have, and then the final is collective school advocacy. Here, there's a hell of a lot of political aspects, namely, what kind of facilities are schools provided, particularly in disadvantaged areas, and what is the turnover? So here you have to deal with really the politics and the quality of the schools. So,
but who is responsible? Who is going to deal with that?
Well, that's the issue that in society we don't really take teaching all that seriously because the advantaged are very pleased with their schools, and they're not. The problem is that in education now we're really eliminating the humanities, and it's all competitively oriented. How are you your kid going to get into Stanford or Harvard and so on? And so there's a tremendous pressure on the kids to do well, and then we have the problem that this means that we're killing off the humanities. Now, what's happening in the area here in Silicon Valley is that the parents have their kids in good schools, and they are developing a system in which they're contributing funds to be used by the school, and so these kids are enriched. They have humanities programs and so on because they're getting outside support. We passed a law years ago that we can't be billed for our home, the usual annual payment. It can't be bigger than 13%. Now that bill has greatly benefited the industries, but it's pretty much killed support for schools. So this is where the public voted for and you can't increase it beyond 13%, and so people thought that they were going to save some money at the cost of reducing markedly the amount of money that the And so the whole question is, what kind of schools do the disadvantaged kids go to, and what kind of teachers do they have? What kind of facilities are they provided? This is all political. And of course, we have the heavy political problem about the school busing, and where are the kids? What kind of schools the kids going to go to? So there's a lot of moral disengagement going on there.
I see what you mean. Well, Dr. Bandura, I promised your assistant Karen to keep it short and not to exceed too much time. So I want to end with a final question. So let's make it a positive question. My last question for you is: what 3 books have made a great impact on you? 3 books and 3 musical songs.
Oh. No, that's very hard to do. The musical songs.
I know you like opera. You like opera.
Nice. Oh yes, but Beethoven's Ninth can't be beat.
Yeah.
And I like Bach.
Yeah, beautiful. Any pop songs as well?
So I love classical music, and
I see.
And the big ones are Beethoven, Bach, Mozart.
Yeah. All right.
And
classical music. And what about books? Which books are really made an impact on you as a person?
Well, I'm so heavily committed to writing, and I get countless emails from people who want help, or it ranges tremendously. I'm suddenly getting emails from high school students who are so enamored with their teacher, and the teacher is so enamored with my work, that they say, could you write something about how much she's done for their students? And so there's this one who is, he asked for a reprint, and apparently this he just couldn't get over it. So a group of them said, could you write something? And I said, sure, that this note is being written on behalf of your really grateful students for your tremendous teaching, and I'm very happy to be in the emissary for them.
Yeah.
And so then that was the advocacy book. They said, could you autograph it? And then they filmed us. He opened it, and he's walking around the room as if he's not. He's just walking around and so on.
Wow.
But anyway, I get countless emails, and I try to answer them. And so that and my working on books, that takes so much of my time. And I'm 94 years old.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Well.
And so I think my time is really pretty much absorbed. So I don't have the luxury of some reading some books and so on.
I see what you mean. But maybe some books from the field of psychology, for example, Richard Herrnstein's Bell Curve. There are some seminal titles, right, that everyone should read.
Yeah, but but I have a hard time working on it. See, I just started a new book.
You did. You are writing a book.
Yeah. Yeah. For example, when I was writing the moral disengagement book, I would get up in the morning and then I would rush out to get the New York Times to see who's the new evildoer.
Who's the new evildoer? Wow.
Yeah. and so I was totally absorbed.
Yeah.
You know, I had to change my style of writing.
Yeah, I see.
And then I had to decide which industries I was going to target. And in that case, I had to go in and study what kind of methodologies are they using, what kind of conclusions are they having, and what impact they're having. So I was working, you know, continuously on that book. And then before then, you see, I don't write small books.
No.
And then, of course, they run for 600 pages or so on.
Yeah.
And
obviously you don't have the time to read books, newspapers, but let's change the question. Which three persons inspire you?
I suppose at the early period, Dollard, I was really impressed with him, and I see it in psychology at Iowa. That was almost entirely dominated by Hollian theorists.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of interesting that the National Institute of Health had a session on what are the new directions in learning and so on. And there were 8 of us there. 6 of them were from Iowa, but none of us were preaching that doctrine. Some went totally cognitive.
Yeah.
I went the direction of, so they were going all in different. Now, what was common is a tremendous respect for the commitment to good theorizing and to good research. And so we benefited from that greatly, but none of us really bought the doctrine. And,
how about the modern-day psychologists like Steven Pinker or Carol Dweck? Do you know any people that inspire you today?
I'm not sure. The Pinker has really, you know, he's gone public and he writes these books saying, you know, that we have a decline in aggression, and I don't know. I look around and it seems to be a hell of a lot of aggression. So he writes the grand analysis of societies and so on, and I don't get very excited about those kind of books. Carol Dweck, she has a very straightforward theory, and she's promoting it very well. I mean, she's selling the theory to schools. She is called upon heavily in terms of she's getting a lot of her which all are warranted. And my daughter got a PhD with her.
Yeah.
And so she's really taken a rather straightforward idea and just translate it and apply it to a variety of reasons. And now it's commercially doing very well. I think there are countless schools who are in my advocacy book. I point out, there should be more statements of limitations. Namely, you can't keep telling kids that if they work hard, they're gonna succeed at some point. And in industry, they're saying we don't have the supports here to treat our development here as a matter of commitment to effort. But my impression is that she's very well. Her theory is very well regarded, and it should be.
Yeah.
But it's a question of the scope.
This fall,
and it's very compatible with social cognitive theory. In fact, I supervised several dissertations of students from the School of Education, which varied different aspects of the kind of feedback they get about performance. And I think in the efficacy book, I cite these studies, and as I mentioned in the two studies, the one having to do with the business school, and the other one to do with athletics and so on. So I find her theory very compatible with social cognitive theory.
Well, that's an excellent conclusion to this interview, Dr. Bandura. I'm really grateful that you took so much time to answer my questions, and I will promote your work here in Holland, because that's my mission, to promote good psychology. So
well, that's been a problem with the books I write are very long, and so it's hard for publishers to translate them into different languages.
It is.
And so that also limits the scope. For example, if you take the self-efficacy book, well, it was translated in Korean, in Japanese, in Italian, and in I think those are the main ones. My short book on social learning theory, that one is translated everywhere because it's a short one.
Yeah.
And people ask me, what's the difference between social learning theory and social cognitive theory? And are these different theories? And so I wrote a paper for one of the psychology journals on this issue. Or the point I'm making is that you can't start out at the outside with a full theory unless you're mad. So theory building is progressive. So social learning theory focused mainly on modeling. The theory evolved into other areas in which I point out it evolved into an agentic theory, and there are four core features of agency, namely you have intentionality, you have forethought, which includes goal setting and outcome expectations.
Yes.
And then it includes self-regulation, where now you adopt standards and you're regulating your own behavior. And the final one is self-reflection, which is measured by self-efficacy.
Yes.
And so these were not separate programs of research, but actually dealing with different facets of human agency. So social learning theory is not somehow a different theory. It just happened to be dealing with only one aspect.
Yeah.
And in this model, modeling is both it's both a source of self-efficacy and also a source for dissemination. Namely, in this new reality, we are not bound by our physical environment anymore.
Yeah.
And an influential model can influence huge numbers of people.
Mm-hmm.
And then they want to retranslate a couple of my earlier books, particularly the self-efficacy one, and so they asked me to write a brief statement. How did the theory change since that book?
Yeah.
And so I point out that in the original book, it treated efficacy as a standalone. Well, now I have three types of efficacy: direct, proxy, and collective.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in terms of application, well, the early one focused on how to develop guided mastery treatments. The new work extended social change to the social cognitive theory in treatment, and also extending it to the global level. And so in that response, I sort of illustrated the different ways in which self-efficacy changed over time. And so the French publisher asked me to write a piece as a foreword, namely, in what way has the theory changed since its original publication.
And when is it going to be published?
Well, probably not for a while, because it's going to be translated into. They're going to have it translated again. But if you write to me, I'll send you a copy of it. Both on there are three papers that one of the psychology journals asked me to write a paper. The first was on modeling. The second was on the agentic theory of psychology. The third was on the applications, and that one, the one is on an agency called Toward a Psychology of Human Agency. Mm-hmm. And then the application, it's how to apply research for human betterment, and that's where I point out the extension of the theory globally.
So that is still to be published?
No. Two of those, or in fact 3 of those, have been published now. And the one I haven't pressed now is the paper on enlisting youth for global application in climate change.
Yeah, great.
That's one who I should probably get.
And the one by the French publisher. You wrote the foreword about how. Yeah. And it's interesting because I began by pointing out that this one person was, when I was getting an award from a health society, they began by saying, if you have a paper that's published 100 times, that's pretty good. If you have a paper that's published 1,000 times, now that's outstanding. Yeah.
And then they say Bandura's, the book on self-efficacy was published 64,000 times.
Amazing.
And his book where the construct was first introduced in the Psych Review has been published 74,000 times.
Wow. Amazing.
So anyway.
So, Mr. Bandura, yeah?
No, go ahead.
I promised your assistant, Karen Saltzman, to keep it short. But you have so many interesting stories. It's just an impossible task, Mr. Bandura. So.
Oh yeah, and it's entertaining. I mean, I've had an entertaining history.
It is. Well.
In conclusion, I still regard this whole thing as surreal. What the hell am I doing here? How in the hell did I get from here to the balmy palms of Stanford? This whole thing is surreal.
That's surreal.
And I don't take it too seriously.
Oh, well, you devoted the paper to chance theory, you know? Defying the odds.
Yeah.
That's been a part of your life, right?
Well, the other thing that I'm emphasizing in this book I'm writing, I have a whole chapter on the fortuity of human life.
Yeah.
And that explains how I got into psychology. It explains, for example, my friend was late getting to the golf course at Iowa, and so we were bumped to a later time, and so there were 2 women ahead of us. They were slowing down. We were speeding up, and I met my wife in the sand trap.
Yeah, serendipity.
Now, and had he come in time, my family life would be totally different.
Yeah.
And then you can see even an earlier link at the University of British Columbia. We had to take 2 PE courses to graduate, and so I took outdoor PE, thinking it would be communing with the muses and so on. And this guy made us run around the stadium. And after about 3/4 through, I said, "I'm going to die of a heart attack." And so I decided to enroll in archery. There's a little movement there.
Excellent.
And then I had indoor PE, and he made us climb these ropes to Disney Heights. So I made a quick descent. And the question is, how does a farm boy end up on a golf course? Well, it turns out I took golf. And if these courses weren't quite so strenuous, I probably would not have done that link.
Yeah.
And then I demonstrate how most of our inventions were by accident.
Yeah.
And in fact, 16 Nobel Prize winners had their origin in fertility.
That's amazing.
And I argue that science can no longer treat fertility as sort of garbage that interferes with their prediction models, but it's time to really treat fertility as an important factor in research.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Bandura, I like to round off. Just also for your health, I promised Karen Saltzman to round up.
Yeah, I won't report you.
Okay, great. If you have any new, if you have,
all good luck in your. You've been really generous in trying to promote the theory, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, if you have
all good wishes in your research.
If you have new material to publish, please send it to me, and I will.
I will.
Yeah.
I will.
All right. Thanks a lot for your time, Dr. Bandura, and have a good day.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Goodbye.